UN News.
Obviously, history is your passion. So how did you develop that interest in history?
I think, to some extent, I've always had that interest in history. It's something that my parents instilled in me, but particularly as it pertains to African and African diaspora history, that was something that developed over the course of being educated in schools that pushed a very Eurocentric type of approach to education. So I particularly remember graduating high school, and then it occurred to me that I knew so much about the history of Europe, the culture of Europe, because that's what the education was centered on, but I knew nothing about African history. So part of me developing that interest in history and then wanting to write about history was just to essentially cure my own ignorance of African history. Researching African history, researching, and this is part of how I came into Pan-Africanism was as well, researching the historical connections among African people internationally. So as I began this process of researching history and educating myself on history in college, I came to the decision that I also wanted to start writing books about this history as well to make it more readily available to individuals. Because as a student in college, I realized I had the advantage of being able to access the database at the university. That's not something that's readily available for a lot of people who aren't actively enrolled in a college campus. So I recognize the fact that being able to go to college gave me a greater degree of access to information about African history that's still not very widely available to the public.
Right. So just to clarify for our audience, you're Guyanese. You're from Guyana. So for those of you who don't know, it's a country, it's part of the Caribbean, but a country in South Africa. So obviously there's a lot of, and you have mixed race yourself. So obviously there's a lot of interconnectedness with different cultures in the Caribbean in particular. So do you feel living in the Caribbean affected the way you viewed yourself in terms of you being mixed race and as a result, you growing up and what you're currently doing, do you feel that had any impact in terms of the way you view the world?
If it did, it wasn't a very noticeable or significant impact from my viewpoint, because the thing about my background is, even though coming from a multiracial background, I was essentially raised by both parents to connect with the African identity, to connect with Black identity. Particularly, my mom. She grew up in Guyana during the 1970s, 1980s, the Black Power era of Caribbean politics. So, there's a prominent Guyanese Pan-Africanist named Walter Rodney. She used to actually attend his rallies in Guyana. So, she came out of that Black Power era in Caribbean politics. So I got that influence from her. My dad, he's also a big influence in terms of shaping my Pan-Africanism. The first time I read a book by Malcolm X was a book that my dad had bought me. So even though I come from a multiracial background, the type of upbringing that was instilled in me really helped to shape and develop a Pan-African consciousness and a Black consciousness about myself. So consciously, I wasn't raised in an environment that made me feel multiracial. The environment that I was raised in was one that made me feel first and foremost Black.
And actually, you kind of answered my next question is how did you, and actually you can add a little bit more if you want, but more of your journey in terms of you becoming a Pan-Africanist yourself. Like what was the thing that made you decide this is what I want to do with my life?
It wasn't one thing, it was multiple things. So starting from the standpoint of, as I said, the upbringing that I came from, just having parents that instilled not just a Black identity in me, but a sense of a global Black identity. So, growing up to me, Black wasn't necessarily separation between Black people in the Caribbean and a separation between Black people in America. I just saw Black people as being one people. And that was essentially the message of the Black Power movement. When I listened to my mom tell stories about growing up during the Black Power era, she would talk about how some of her biggest influences would be some of the artists, and it'd be artists like Peter Tosh, it'd be artists like Earth, Wind, and Fire. So she's coming up in Guyana in the Black Power era, where Jamaican artists or African American artists are helping to shape her consciousness. So part of my Pan Africanism was just that global influence that was instilled into me by my parents. The other part of it was just studying the history, and I'll never forget the first time I heard about Nat Turner, who led a slave rebellion in America. I was thinking about Kofi. Kofi is a national hero in Guyana. Kofi led a slave rebellion in Guyana. So I started thinking about the fact that, as African Americans were struggling against slavery in the United States, African people in the Caribbean were struggling against slavery ourselves. We were having our own rebellions against slavery. So that also helped us develop my Pan-African consciousness as well, starting to recognize those connections and starting to recognize the similar struggles that African people globally have been fighting um, on an international level. And one thing that definitely did help to shape my Pan African consciousness was the earthquake that happened in Haiti several years ago. I was in high school at
Hmm.
the time, and I remember, Haiti was not a country I used to think about very often until the earthquake happened. And I started really pondering, there's this country in the Caribbean that's, mostly black country, and the people there seem to be really impoverished. And I started thinking about the conditions of African people in the United States, the conditions of African people again, and I started really questioning to myself, why is it every time I find a country with people who look like me in the world, we seem to be in the same situation. We seem to be struggling against the same poverty,
Right.
struggling against the same political oppression. And at the time, it started with a question of why is it that way? Part of uncovering the history and studying the history was me arriving at the answer that it was a very deliberate process in terms of how the colonial powers divided African people for the purposes of not only exploiting us but keeping us in states of oppression and a state of under development. So it wasn't necessarily one thing that led me to Pan Africanism. It was multiple different things. It was my upbringing. It was just certain observations about the historical struggles of African people, certain observations about contemporary struggles of African people. And I know one particular incident that was very influential for me. At the time, I was already a Pan Africanist from the standpoint of I'd been studying Pan African history, writing about Pan African history. But 2014 really reinforced my view that Pan Africanism is something that is still relevant to African people and something that's still necessary for African people. And what happened in 2014 was that's when the protests were happening in Ferguson in the United States over Mike Brown
Mhm.
being killed. 2014 was also massive uprisings and protests in Haiti against the corrupt government that was in power there. And 2014 was when the revolution in Burkina Faso happened that overthrew the dictatorship in Burkina Faso. So I'm looking at these different struggles around the world and I'm realizing that Black people in the United States, in the Caribbean, and in Africa are struggling against oppression simultaneously. But the problem is that these are mostly fragmented struggles. They're disconnected. They're not unified like the struggles in the 60s and the 70s and even the
Mhm.
80s were unified. So 2014 is when I started really putting everything together in terms of this Pan-African vision, realizing that globally African people are still fighting the same struggles, but as I pointed out, unfortunately, we don't have the same level of connection that we did in decades prior, and that also was part of a deliberate effort to dismantle the Pan-African movement.